Hey everyone, and welcome to this very special World Press Freedom Day Free Assange Vigil. Today we have three very special guests and one more that will be joining us later. And then Steve, myself, and then Taylor Hudak will be joining as a special guest host a little later today. But we have Cynthia McKinney, Ray McGovern, and Kevin Gonzalez with us today. How are you doing, Kevin? I apologize about the name mess up.
It's good. It's Kevin Gastola.
How are you doing, Cynthia?
I'm doing great. Well, I mean, given everything that's going on in the world, I could be doing a whole lot better, but right now I'm okay.
Wonderful. And how about you, Ray?
Like Cynthia, I'm okay now, but that's only because I'm in with good company.
So just to give a little
World
count,
Press Freedom Day. We're all here in order to kind of bring to front and center the fact that on World Press Freedom Day, it's an extra just tragic element that a man like Julian Assange has to spend it in 23 and a half hours of lockdown in the Guantanamo Bay of the United Kingdom. I guess I just kind of want to open up a conversation between the three of you as to the nature of the importance of public disclosure outlets like Wikileaks and how we can help proliferate the existence of these outlets in an era where public disclosure outlets have been listed on the 2020 NDAA as right up there with ISIS and Hezbollah.
Well, first of all, I'll take the bait and say that if we didn't have governments that kept so many secrets, then we would not need to have these kinds of platforms like WikiLeaks. But WikiLeaks is entirely important for us to understand exactly what it is that our government is doing and how our government is using our tax dollars. And we, the people, the citizens of all of the countries about which there have been disclosures, we have a right to know what our government is doing.
That's exactly right. Cynthia, you put your finger right on it. If it were not for WikiLeaks, we would not know about several war crimes committed in Afghanistan and Iraq. War crimes that have been sort of dismissed or suppressed by people who have an interest in prosecuting war and profiteering from it. It's a obvious thing to me that if WikiLeaks were up and running at full speed and the coronavirus thing became apparent to people in the WHO, even maybe a person in Beijing or in Wuhan, okay? Now, if they saw that the world was not taking this seriously, if they listened to Trump waiting 2 months, maybe 3, before they did anything about it, and realized the seriousness of this, well, if WikiLeaks were, they would have thought to go to WikiLeaks and could have prevented a lot of this unnecessary death. I mean, that's big. We have friends, and I've written an article about this, who before 9/11 knew it was coming. They could see it. They had the evidence. They couldn't get their betters in Washington to pay heed, okay? Now, I've asked them, if WikiLeaks were available in 2000, 2001, would you have gone out of desperation to WikiLeaks as a secure way to get the message out and perhaps not get caught? And they said unequivocally, of course we would, of course we would. And the same goes for the preparation for the war in Iraq, based on false pretenses. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There were no ties with Al-Qaeda. At least 100 intelligence analysts knew that. Now, I've asked them, if WikiLeaks were up and running then, would you have gone to WikiLeaks? And they said, we surely would have. Okay, so this is not inconsequential. This is not a matter of just history. It has to do with giving people the opportunity and a secure way to get the word out that can save thousands, maybe even 1 million lives when we get finished with this COVID-19 thing. So this is the perspective at which I come at this. And if American people knew, if we could find some way to break through and say, look, there's a solution to this kind of thing. There's a solution to what Cynthia just mentioned, the unnecessary secrecy of government, but it has to be protected. And you can't put people in jail for the rest of their life for using this kind of new technology.
Yeah, I'd add that public disclosure journalism is more important than ever, especially when you think about the fact that for the most part, we are led to believe that the most pressing issue of our time is the fact that journalists are being denied access to a White House press briefing room. And that just is not the most pressing issue that we have to deal with. The thing that we need to be focused on is the rights of journalists and making sure that people aren't suffering retaliation when they go to disclose materials, especially if they're independent journalists that don't have the kind of structures that come when you work for a New York Times or Washington Post, because they have counsels, they have lawyers, they have teams of people that can fight off the government and provide a little bit of protection from this if they do decide to practice robust journalism. I think that, you know, when you look at where things are at and how WikiLeaks pioneered the kind of journalism that we need, you come away with this realization that they were at the forefront of introducing anonymity back into journalism, re-emphasizing the ability of people to come forward, share this information, and not face the kinds of effects that would come if they attached their name to these pieces of the documents that were published. Having that kind of ability in this hyper technology atmosphere that we have to provide documents somewhere, trying to promise to people that you wouldn't be able to be detected if you provided that information. Working to have some kind of a system where you can do that is tremendously important. And we can see it's important because in the records that we've been able to find from government where they are focused on unearthing who these individuals are, you know, they're very focused on figuring out how people are using things like secure drop, the ways in which they're using these new technologies in order to cloak and hide themselves so that they can share information and do journalism. You know, they're focused in the same way that you could go back to the 60s and 70s and see J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI, and then look at the CIA as well, of being interested in trying to expose and unravel what journalists were doing and discredit what journalists were doing. You see that same zeal in our US government today to go after people who are using these new technologies to do journalism.
But the problem, though, in my opinion, is that the government doesn't hesitate to use these technologies to further repression. And so that's what makes WikiLeaks so important. For example, since we are in the context of COVID-19, let me just say that the policy prescription that I have in the light of the activities that are taking place all over the world in US funded level 3 and level 4 biolabs is that first and foremost, shut them all down. If we don't know what kind of research is being done in those biolabs, then shut them down. And we need to have a list of just exactly where they are located in the world. There used to be a list. It was located on the Federation of American Scientists website. And then, of course, it got taken down. So this is information that we are supposed to have, we ought to have, and we need to know just exactly what kind of research our government is involved in. Let me also just say to the value of the WikiLeaks documents, because what we get from WikiLeaks is not opinion, is not supposition, is not presupposition. It's hard data. And it's the kind of data that behavioral scientists, political scientists, international relations specialists can use to formulate how individuals or communities or states behave. For example, when I was doing my dissertation on the transformational leadership of Hugo Chavez, I relied on the WikiLeaks documents. Well, the experience that I had was sort of backwards because I had all of this wonderful information, hard data, cables from the United States State Department, everything about U.S. attitudes toward Chavez, not only the attitudes, but the outright behaviors to thwart his leadership on behalf of the people of Venezuela, and not just Venezuela, but the Caribbean and Africa as well, because he was involved, he was a global leader. Well, when the time came for me to turn in my dissertation, I was told that I could have no reference to WikiLeaks in my document. So then I had to go back and take out all of the hard data and then put in information from the media about what the content of the hard data was. So this was just absolutely ridiculous. But remember, at that time, Barrett Brown had been prosecuted by the Obama administration for using really some of the same information that I had used in my dissertation. And so the librarian, because now librarians at universities, which goes to lack of freedom of thought and freedom of research in U.S. universities. So now the librarian was afraid that the FBI was going to come knocking on her door and say, okay, you're going to get prosecuted because you allowed this dissertation to be published. Now, what we learned in the process of researching how it was that I had to remove all of my references to WikiLeaks was that there was not one single dissertation in 2015 that had used WikiLeaks as a source that was public. There was one dissertation that used it, but it was sealed. Can you believe it?
I mean, I can believe it, but only because we've had conversations about how the university system has become the de facto home of COINTELPRO, and we've had the conversations with other people who are coming through their master's program who have had their master's thesis turned away because they've used WikiLeaks material in their presentations. Before we get to the next question, I want to give a big thank you to the Anonymous Fights Back Network for rebroadcasting this, and a thank you to Jormark Lubbers for streaming this. I know that he's into hearing his name read out aloud on the air, so we're going to go ahead and handle that.
And also, too, Alex with Candles for Assange has done an awesome job organizing the events that started in Australia at midnight Eastern time and are still continuing today. And she's been running the computer for that most of the time. So she's just been a true champion through all this. She's going on like 25 hours without sleep. So I just want to give her a big thank you too.
Could we talk a little bit about the impact that collateral murder, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the Gitmo files have had on journalism, period, and then the attack on journalism going forward? And I'll leave that open to whoever wants to jump in and take it. Okay, I'll start assigning.
Well, maybe I could start. Okay. I can start. Let's take the collateral murder. Not many Americans have seen that, but those who have and have a soul still must be highly ashamed at not only what our troops did to others, killing civilians, but what our country has done to those troops. I mean, just think about those gunners. How have they fit back into society now? Why were they not held to account in some way or other? Now, we know that there was a Washington Post reporter with that unit. His name was David Finkel, okay? And he knew about the tape. He didn't touch it, of course. He later wrote a book about this wonderful patriotic unit, the same one, okay? And he got plaudits for it, and now he's a big gun on the Washington Post. So that puts it in bas relief, in my view. These were atrocities. These were visual things where you could see and hear the people we send into war kill civilians, okay? So what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that without this knowledge, without this way to get this knowledge out, we're forced to rely on the David Finkels of this world, and that's not enough. The last thing I'll say here has to do with the Afghan war logs and the Iraqi war logs. What people said immediately, the commander of U.S. forces, commander of NATO forces, and all the commanders said, it's awful. This is awful. This endangers our troops. People are going to be wrapped up and killed, and people cooperate with us will be wiped off the face of the earth. Now, as those rumors went around, there was a fellow named Levin, who was Carl Levin. He was head of the Senate Armed Forces Committee. And he called the Secretary of Defense at that time, Robert Gates, and he said, Mr. Gates, can you give me a memo on that? I want a damage assessment of what this has caused. And Gates said, okay. He came back 2 weeks later. Actually, it was in a speech. And he said, these reports of our sources and our cooperators about them being killed or molested are, in his words, quote, significantly overwrought. Okay. Now, I know Gates used to work for me when he was a CIA analyst. He chooses his words very carefully. Now, what he said was there was no real damage. And the commander of our forces in Afghanistan and Iraq said the same, and so did the Pentagon. So all that stuff was dismissed very early on, okay? Now, what do we see at the trial of Julian Assange, at the hearing in Belmarsh prison? The prosecutor, Her Majesty's counselor, starts out with saying, this is terrible damage. There are hundreds of people who have disappeared and are presumed to have been killed because they named or they're alluded to, and it's awful, and that's just where we have to get this guy and stop it, okay? Now, then he said, now the U.S. Can't vouch for this information. They don't have any names. It's just really a matter of people they used to cultivate disappearing, and the assumption is that it was because they were killed because of, hello, this suffices in a court that's supposed to be a court of law. So with respect to these things, there was no damage. Take Robert Gates's word for it, if you will. Charges of that were significantly overwrought, and they were still significantly overwrought when this hearing began. So you put those things together, and you have how much the U.S. government wants to prevent people from really knowing the real deal here, and that so far they've been successful. And let me just close by saying I'd like to invoke what I call the Noah principle. Okay. Now, the Noah principle is no more awards for predicting rain, rewards only for building arcs. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we know the situation. I hope that today and subsequent days, we can figure out what kinds of arcs to build here, because there's so much material that's come out recently, especially human material. And I have this vapid hope that Americans and other people of the world really care about human things. And when you see these two new little sons of Julian, Gabriel and Max and his fiancée, I mean, that introduces a real human element. And in my view, that explains to me why Julian Assange, who's a strong person to begin with, has a very strong interest in living, avoiding the plague and avoiding prison for the rest of his life. So all that stuff, I think, can be used as little arcs to build so that we're not just predicting rain, so that we're building arcs.
I would like to pick up where Ray has left off with this idea of building arcs and remind our audience that it's vitally important that we also play a role in deciding who's going to build the arcs, because the construction materials and the design might not be what we want, but we'll get an arc, but it just won't work for us. Mm-hmm. So toward that end, what I've thought about is what I would like to see coming from the United States Congress. So we had one statement from Rand Paul, and he basically said, well, let's just provide immunity and get him over here and let him testify so that we can know everything that he knows, or at least begin to know the things that he knows, or that, you know, those as yet unpublished information that WikiLeaks might have in its possession. Well, I think that was a step in the right direction, but you notice no one else has said anything. And the powers of the United States Congress are immense, but the power of one U.S. senator is perhaps could save Julian's life. And so now I think it's incumbent upon those of us who understand how to wield power that we have. We've got to get better people building these arcs. And we cannot accept substandard construction, which is what we have been accepting all along so far.
So let me go back to hit a few points here about how WikiLeaks has changed journalism. This is both a personal and a political answer. For me, I did a lot of my early work and was able to get my name out because I was using the entire cache of diplomatic cables that was published. And I made daily work out of going through this archive and looking at what exactly the US empire was up to, privately and publicly, because when you saw what their public actions were, you could compare it to what was happening privately and get closer to some truth. You'll notice if you go to the Washington Post or the New York Times or some of these other establishment media outlets, that as much as they dislike Julian Assange, they found the materials that were disclosed by WikiLeaks to be quite valuable in their work. You'll notice that events that have unfolded in the last couple of years were contextualized with the cables. What happened in Bolivia with the coup against Evo Morales, where he had to flee. What happened with the failed coup attempt in Venezuela. What's been happening throughout Latin America and other parts of the world. You're able to see that these U.S. outlets, as much as they may be swallowing what intelligence agencies are giving them and using that as the official story or their official narrative, they're still referring to what's in these U.S. documents. Another thing to point out is that you've had projects that were able to be launched in the last decade that got us closer to understanding what happened in wars. There was the Iraq Body Count Project that gave us a fuller picture of how many civilian deaths, and not just like how many we guess died in this war, but getting us closer to actually documenting the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who throughout Iraq had died because of the Iraq War. So I think that's quite crucial. When you go down the list of some of these revelations that came out, I think, one thing that does get under discussed is the Guantanamo detainee assessment files. It's just worth noting that those were crucial in giving us a clear picture of the fact that these people who were rounded up and brought to this prison weren't ever the dangerous people that Donald Rumsfeld or anyone in the administration led us to believe. And in fact, there were people there like Al Jazeera journalist Sami al-Hajj, who was sent to the prison because of the fact that he was working for the Al Jazeera news network, and that he was there. He was brought there because they believed that Al Jazeera was involved in some kind of terrorist type journalism, that he was there because, and I quote, this is from the document, that they wanted to interrogate him about Al Jazeera News Network's training program, their telecommunications equipment and news gathering operations in Chechnya, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, including the network's acquisition of a video of Osama bin Laden and a subsequent interview. So they were using Sami al-Hajj as a way to collect intelligence. They rounded him up, they put him in indefinite detention in Guantanamo Bay, and they were and this is just one example of what was happening at Guantanamo, but that he was targeted basically because of the journalism that Al Jazeera was engaged in the region. And that's one example, that's one story out of many that we got from these Guantanamo files.
Mm-hmm.
If I could continue with Kevin's discussion about how I don't know what we call it, the corporate funded, the foundation funded media, whatever you want to call that entity, but that spans the political spectrum from left to right, how the WikiLeaks revelations actually forced coverage. So the WikiLeaks documents actually can change the subject about what is being discussed. And that's why not only having such a platform is important, but that the releases coming from WikiLeaks are also important. If we compare the WikiLeaks documents that have been released, and I'm hoping that there are a lot more that will be released so that we can have a different discussion on different topics. But if we compare WikiLeaks to, for example, the Snowden documents, I'm still waiting for the Snowden documents, and we haven't seen them. So WikiLeaks published and gave us facts, whereas the Snowden documents, I don't know whatever happened to them, and then people got laid off, and things just became so things changed, and I'm wondering, WikiLeaks shows us the commitment to journalism of Julian and those who worked with WikiLeaks and whose lives have been decimated as a result of their working with WikiLeaks. Mm-hmm. Because Julian is paid a personal price, but Julian is not alone. There are others associated with WikiLeaks who also have paid a personal price for their commitment to journalism.
I'd like to add a word about the diplomatic cables, Cablegate. They were a treasure trove, and not only for people who take a deep interest in what happened, for example, in the Soviet Union and Russia. Let me give you one good example. Most Americans don't know that we were warned not to expand NATO right up to the borders of the Soviet Union or Russia. Most people don't know that we promised not to do that. Really promised. And the Germans were with us, and it was a quid pro quo, if I could use that expression. The Russians needed to be persuaded to accept a reunited Germany. My God. Having suffered what the Soviets and the Russian people and the other peoples in the Soviet Union had suffered at the hands of the Nazis, you can imagine what a bitter pill this was. As a matter of fact, it was the universal policy of the West and the East to keep Germany divided, okay? To give us, to keep the U.S. in, keep Russia out, and keep the Germans down. And those are the words of the first NATO Secretary General, okay? Now, most people in America don't know that the Russians lost 25 or 26 million, like a million with an M, in World War II. And the U.S. forces, well, every person is sacred, of course, but the U.S. forces suffered maybe 450,000 people killed. Now, what I'm saying is this. The Russians have this sensitivity about being invaded. Most people don't know that they were invaded by Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, the Zolotaya Orda, okay? Now, how long did they stay? Would you believe two centuries and 20 years? So when we're coming out of the Dark Ages into the Renaissance, the Russians are still fighting off Genghis Khan. Then they're invaded by the Swedes and by the Lithuanians, and by the Hanseatic League, and then later by the French, and then finally by the Nazis. So you can imagine that they have a little historic antipathy to being invaded. So here's my point. When I looked at the Cablegate documents, I saw one that was a treasure. It was from Moscow. It was a cable written by our ambassador, and I'll remember his name in a second, who was invited into the Soviet Foreign Ministry by Sergei Lavrov. Now, I said Soviet, I meant Russian. Lavrov had just become foreign minister, and he said that Mr. Burns, was Ambassador Bill Burns. Mr. Burns, there is a lot of discussion about Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. And I just want to ask you, Mr. Burns, do you know what "niet" means? This is in the cable, okay? So this is not McGovern making this up, okay? And Bill Burns said, yeah, I know. He says, well, look, Mr. Burns, if you expand NATO or try to Ukraine or to Georgia, we will have to oppose that. There will be civil war in Ukraine, for example. We'll have to decide whether to intervene or not and reverse this. So look, you tell your Secretary of State, "Niet" means "niet." It's a red line, okay? You don't add Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. What was the date of that? February 1st, 2008. Now, our policymakers laughed at that, and on April 3rd, 2008, so what, just 2 months later, a Supreme Declaration out of a NATO summit in Bucharest said Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because it was documentary, okay? If I've seen one cable out of Embassy Moscow, I've seen about 5,000, okay? There it is. It all hangs out there. And we dissed it. And in those days, we felt we could. But when we come up to 2014, when we organized, and I mean this seriously, this was the most blatant coup in American history. When we organized this coup in Kiev on the 22nd of February, 2014, so about 6 years later, that was the end of the plan to expand NATO to Ukraine. And if U.S. policymakers, didn't realize that the Russians are not going to give up their only free, ice-free, that is, warm water port in Sevastopol, in Ukraine, in Crimea, then they just didn't know anything about the Russians. So how important is this? This is incredibly important. Now, the other side of this, of course, and I'll end here, is that my State Department colleagues are allergic to having their private discussions with other diplomats or foreign ministry people being revealed. I can understand that, okay? There's a real conflict here. How can people trust that Americans, what they say or what they say to Americans will not be revealed? But there's a greater good here. And it's not a historic anecdote here. It explains exactly what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Some people believe that was deliberate. We knew that the Russians would react that way, and therefore we put the spike in what had been a burgeoning improvement in relations with Russia as a result of Russia's persuading Syria to give up all its chemical weapons. So all this stuff is very historically relevant, and I give the edge to total revelation with respect to diplomats who are really concerned about what they say or what is said to them is revealed.
I wonder what if there's a line between what constitutes like diplomatic secure communications channels. Like, are we expected to give a diplomat more leeway than our government gives us, or than those diplomats would give us in the regards of our own privacy? Are we supposed to respect their position more because they're diplomats, or do we all have to live under the same sort of set of rules regarding our own digital privacy? It's just,
Well, I would simply respond that there are legitimate reasons for secrecy. And you want to make sure that your interlocutor in Moscow or Beijing can have a modicum of trust when he tells you something that's very sensitive. And so that's why I say this is a value that cannot be simply dismissed, but is a value, in my view, that is dwarfed by the need for people to know, for example, why it was that the Russians reacted when we tried to take Ukraine into NATO.
No, yeah, I think that satisfies what I was getting at. We're joined right now by Original Action for Assange co-host Taylor Hudak. She's of course now an integral part of Activism Munich. Taylor, I don't know if you have a question for the panel or not, but if you do, please fire away. And it's good to see you. It is.
I know, it's good to see you guys. It's good to be back here, Steve. I really like the background. I've been meaning to tell you, it looks good and I like it. The forest. So I just I'm really glad that we're doing this today. We actually planned this out. Andrew, if you remember, like a year ago, I'm like, World Press Freedom Day is the 3rd. We need to do something. So we had this planned out for some time, and this is a really awesome panel. We have Ray returning, Cynthia, and Kevin, who I had the pleasure of meeting in London. Very much relied on his tweets from inside the courtroom to cover this hearing. But because this is World Press Freedom Day, I'll open it up to our guests. One of you want to chime in here just about this is a very broad and basic question, but I think it's worth, of course, talking about, if you haven't already, the most significant press freedom case of the modern era, which is Assange's case, and perhaps what your greatest concerns are, or any statements you want to make about this case, and also the judge's latest decision to postpone this hearing, and does that give you any hope in this case moving forward? And thank you all for coming on and taking the time today.
Well, I guess, first of all, I would just like to say thank you to all of you who are our hosts today and the participants along with me today. But there has been a global outpouring of support and love for Julian Assange and the work of Wikileaks that I think is most appropriate, but sad. But it saddens me that it's necessary. And so what I would just like to do first and foremost is just say thank you to all of those who have gone out of their way. There's been the host of vigils that took place so that Julian's name would not be forgotten. It's important for us to say his name, and we just have to do that every chance we get. So like for me, I've made a personal commitment. Anytime I see something relating to Julian or WikiLeaks on my social media, I share it or I retweet it I make sure that at least I'm doing that. I support those people who are out there, who were out there on at the time when Julian got snatched. That and the vigils that were actually out there at the in front of the Ecuadorian embassy as well. So there has been a global outpouring of support, and the things that we do, even including this very small commitment of our time and energy. Our goal is to save Julian's life, which is really at risk now. And we need to understand that it's not really about, it's not just World Journalism Day. This is the future of our political system at risk. And so even though, I'd be the first one to tell you that we have a lot of problems with the political systems in the West. But if you want to get away from tyranny and away from repression and oppression, continued oppression, then we have no choice but to stand up. And to even do more, Ray stood up and got beaten down in an audience. These are the kinds of things that we have to do. And I'm just pleased to be in the company. Kevin, your stories, I mean, I've read your stories like forever, and I see you. And you're a young person, and you've done so much. So it just reminds us that there's so much more that we need to do. But first and foremost, today, we want to save Julian's life.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd say that I'm most concerned by the fact that we've allowed it to enter the discussion as to this debate that I think is completely frivolous, but it actually matters because the powers that be have made it matter. This question of whether Julian Assange is a journalist or not. I mean, I think first off, the fact that they've been able to make this a debate is really troubling. But we lost that long ago when they were able to make it a question as to whether he was a journalist. And I think we lost because there are a number of press freedom groups who are supposed to be protecting people's rights who failed in making it abundantly clear that Julian Assange is in fact a journalist. I mean, I agree with some people who say that it doesn't really matter to the charges. And I think that is true because it isn't just targeting journalists the way that these charges have been brought against Julian Assange. Anyone who's publishing information could be targeted and brought under prosecution. But that said, I mean, I think it needs to be said during this discussion here that when he was hauled out of the embassy, when he was expelled, he was a member of the International Federation of Journalists. He had a press card with this organization. He's also had a card with the Media, Entertainment, and Arts Alliance in Australia. It's something I dug up because I was very upset that the Committee to Protect Journalists declined to list him as a journalist who was imprisoned at the end of 2019. He did not make their index, their list of people who were jailed around the world. And there's a number of reasons why that happened. I mean, if we get back to this and want to talk about it later, why some of these institutions don't back Julian Assange, we can talk about that later. But I just think one of the things that most troubles me is how the press, people who are in my profession, have made it tremendously difficult to stand up and speak out for Julian Assange. I mean, they've created a kind of neo-McCarthyism, so to speak, for people who see what Julian Assange is doing as something that's valuable. There's all kinds of ways that public mobbing and character assassination has been encouraged in the last decade. That was documented by Niels Meltzer in his work examining the ways in which the governments of Ecuador, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States have mistreated and abused Julian Assange. It does not just involve the way that he was held and not allowed to move and the way in which they brought charges against him. It also includes the way in which people aligned with the government have used the press in order to poison the water and make it difficult for people to support Julian Assange. So I think that needs to be said. And then the other thing is just the bare fact that he is not a U.S. citizen. Julian Assange is not a U.S. citizen. So he should not be required to, I mean, nobody should, but he should not be required to follow the rules and guidelines that are being set by the U.S. government. And so if he wants to align with governments who the United States does not like, who at this moment make the top 5 of the enemies list that our United States government has, well, that's his choice, and he can do that because he's not an American, and he shouldn't have to carry the baggage of trying to live as an American when he's an Australian who lives, who was living or trying to live in the United Kingdom before he was picked up, or before he had to seek political asylum in an embassy in the UK. And they're trying to impose a secrecy law in the United States against somebody who is not an American. And that is, if that actually succeeds, that will be setting a precedent that will be very, very, like anybody around the world who runs these governments that have power could do that to other people. I've listed off several countries when talking about this case, of like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, these countries that don't have good records on press freedom. Immediately, you can imagine them wanting to follow suit and do what the United States is doing to Julian Assange.
Yeah, if I could jump in here, Kevin, you're exactly right. They are following suit. And that's part of the reason why they're trying to make him out to be a terrorist, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So terrorists, that's a sort of international thing, right? I remember being on CNN early on, I think it was 2011, okay? It was a time when the major media was trying to make Julian Assange out to be a terrorist. It was a time when a fellow named Biden, Joe Biden, called him a high-tech terrorist, right? And so I was invited to go on to CNN to talk about Julian. And I said, wow, this is great. You know, what I didn't realize, because I don't watch it, is because they already had 8 people on there saying, hey, he's a terrorist. Of course he's a terrorist. He's a terrorist. And so somebody must have said, hey, CNN, fair and balanced. You ought to have some person, some naive person who doesn't think he's a terrorist. And they picked me. Okay. So I'm on there with Don Lemon. And Don Lemon starts this program with some clips from Bonnie and Clyde. Bonnie and Clyde, shooting them up, you know. See? Now, luckily, I wasn't aware of that because that was done out in New York. Then he brings me on and says, oh, Mr. McGovern, you say he's not a terrorist. Your group, Veteran Intelligence Professionals, you say he's not. How can you say he's not a terrorist? Well, you can get the clip. I'm not going to go through it. But I was prepared. And, you know, I thought at the end of that thing, oh, you know, the only regret I have is sort of a charitable thing about Don Lemon. He must have lost his job now, you know, for asking these stupid questions and me having it. Well, no, he's got his own show now, right? And guess what? That was the last time I was invited to speak by CNN. Before that, I had gotten on twice a year, 3 times a year. So the terrorist thing is very potent, and that's what they like to use. Now, the other thing is this. It's working, okay? It's working. The National Defense Authorization Act, the bill, the fact that someone could come in and snatch Kevin and put him in jail, not forever, by the way, not forever. Don't exaggerate. Just till the end of the war on terror, right? Okay. And they probably wouldn't get me because, as Cynthia pointed out, that Kevin is very young, and me, you know, it doesn't really matter very much. But what I'm saying here is that let's take James Risen. Now, James Risen used to have terrific sources. Oh man, he had great sources. He wrote 2 terrific books, very good books, based on classified information that people in the intelligence community passed to him. And he could write these books. One of them happened to be the fact that Cheney and Bush had started monitoring all our telephone calls and our emails, way back when. And when did Risen learn this? Well, I learned this in the summer of 2004. And what did he want to write? Write it up. Well, no, this is better. The New York Times said, no. It's an election year. We talked to the White House and they said, no, better not do that. It's too close to the election. He says, July. I don't know. So long story short, the New York Times didn't touch it until a year and a half later in December 2005, when they had to admit this was going on. In the meantime, we got 4 more years of George W. Bush, okay? Why? Because the New York Times knows what's best for the American people. Now, fast forward, go back to Risen. What's he doing now? Well, The Intercept needed somebody like Risen, or at least his name. And so he joined The Intercept. And what's the first thing he wrote? Is Donald Trump a traitor? He swallowed whole cloth, this myth about Russian interference and all this kind of stuff. And so he made his name for The Intercept. Now, is he going to write any more books? I don't think so. Why? Because nobody's going to talk to him. Not because of what he did with The Intercept, but because it's just too dangerous. So Risen's lost all his sources, lost his whole life as a responsible, educated journalist with good sources, and he's become, well, let me just say that he chose an appearance on the Hill's video to characterize Bill Binney, my colleague in Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, who knows a lot about NSA. I characterized Bill Binney as a conspiracy theorist because he disputes the notion that it was the Russians that hacked into the DNC. Let me say that again, that the Russians hacked into the DNC. One little footnote on that, and then I'll quit. When the intelligence community, when 17 agencies of no, it wasn't 17. What was it? It was only 3. And actually, it wasn't 3. It was just handpicked analysts from those 3, from the CIA, from NSA, and from the FBI. Who are these handpicked analysts? Well, I think James Comey picked John Brennan, and John Brennan picked James Comey, and they picked the guy from NSA. Those handpicked analysts. Okay, the only correct thing that memo mislabeled the intelligence community assessment of 6 January 2017. The only correct thing was saying was that Wikileaks has an unequaled reputation for accuracy. Whoa! Had that come in? Well, because they had to discover why the Russians would give this to WikiLeaks. Because if they gave it to WikiLeaks, everyone would interpret it as genuine. So there you have a backhanded compliment to WikiLeaks from whom? From these handpicked analysts, which I have found out are James Comey, this guy Alexander Rogers from NSA, and Comey. Now, Comey and Brennan. Now, I exaggerate a little. Certainly, they recruited some sycophants to help them draft this thing. I don't think they could have drafted it as bad as it is in its prose by themselves. But, there you go. Have a left-handed compliment to WikiLeaks. But the more important thing is, in my view, that this intimidation campaign, which is the acme of which is what's happening to Julian Assange, is working. Nobody's daring to talk to the likes of James Risen anymore, and so he's reduced to calling the president a traitor and regurgitating stuff about Russiagate and calling Bill Binney, who knows which end is up, a conspiracy theorist.
So we've got about 5 more minutes left with Cynthia McKinney, and then you've got to go, Doc. So if you want to field this, and I just want to thank you so much for being able to be with us today. You are hands down a hero of action for Assange. We love you very much. And we would love to be able to follow up with you for a stretched out vigil one of these days.
Absolutely. The one thing I want to add to what both Ray and Kevin have said is about this aspect of it's working and the demise of journalism that actually imparts knowledge and is informational. I'm running, it just ended, a poll on my Twitter. And so the question I posed was, what kind of leadership would you rather have? Now, the response to this poll is very telling, because one is face leadership that's selected by the neocons, the deep state, the powers that be, whatever you want to call that group of people that represent, say, the 1%. Or would you like to have leadership that is authentic, that comes from your community, that you know and that you can trust? And guess what got 42%? Well, 42% of the respondents of this, it's not a scientific poll, but it's just a social media poll, said they don't know the difference. And so this is critical. And this is where journalism has failed. And this is how the republic fails. And this is how we slide into a different kind of political system that none of us supports, which makes me want to say, okay, well, if you want to go that way, then let's just get rid of the government altogether. I'll go that way as well. But the idea that the demise of journalism leads to the public at large not even being able to decipher what is good for them. It's a shame. It's a shame, which means that we have to do more. So as I leave, I invite you to please reach out to me. And, before I was in Asia, because, once you're blacklisted, you can't get a job anywhere in the United States or in the West. And so I was working in Asia, but with this given context of today that we're in, I'm in the United States and I'm available. I'm even available for some direct actions if you want to do that too.
Good.
Oh yeah. Well, thank you so much, Cynthia McKinney. It's always, I'm going to say always, I've only got the opportunity to speak to you once before, but it's terrific to have you on. I'm glad you're back stateside. I have heard through the grapevine that you're going to be on the same radio network as my good friend Ben Balderson, and I look forward to hearing that. And until we see you again, please take care of yourself and stay in touch with us. We're very honored to have you on board. We are.
Ray, it's wonderful seeing you, and Kevin, it was wonderful finally seeing your face and
good to see you.
Getting to sit with you. Bye-bye.
Godspeed.
And we get to welcome to the stream now consortium news journalist and just wonderful human being, Elizabeth Voss. I'm very, very pleased to see you again. I'm a fan of the orange behind you. It looks awesome. And we're now into like overtime as far as this goes. So we can, there's no set time limit for anyone to be here. You can talk as much as you want or as little as you want. But let's cover some groundwork while we do this. As World Press Freedom Day rolls on, and we've got, pure journalists here now. And I don't mean pure as, I just like, that's what you do. You're right for a living. what would you say to people who are trying to enter journalism through a university system? And what kind of advice would you give them to be able to sidestep the barriers that have been put in place institutionally?
Kevin, do you want to go for that one?
Well, you just joined. We should let you have a chance to talk.
Well,
Nobody's heard from you yet.
I think that if someone were to ask me that either as an acquaintance or a friend, I would say that, you know, I got my bachelor's degree in English literature. I didn't ever think I was going to do journalism. In fact, I took a couple of journalism courses to kind of feel out whether I would want to go that direction, and I absolutely detested it. So I mean, I definitely didn't come around to this thinking I was going to be a journalist. I just decided that, I mean, when I saw what happened in 2016 with the level of just outright, like really fake news that was happening, I realized anybody with half a brain cell could do better. So I just started writing. So I think I would give that advice to people. It's like, you know, if you have half a brain cell, you can do better than most mainstream journalists. So please, you know, it's a matter of having the self-confidence to actually say, yeah, I think some of my thoughts are worth listening to. And there are so many people on Twitter, and I you know, Misty, who's joined us before, who are just amazing. They have amazing insight. And I just wish that they would put those insights into a blog form. You know, Curry Dobson on Twitter as well. Some people like that who, you know, if Twitter suspends them, it's going to be a huge shame to lose all of their insights. And so basically, I would say that it's not difficult. You don't have to feel that you're qualified in order to do it, except that you have thoughts that you'd like to share and you feel that you have the time to do it. I know that a lot of people don't have the time. They're trying to, you know, make ends meet, so they don't feel that they can take that time to write. But if you do have the time, especially now with the coronavirus situation happening, I think really anybody should feel that they are qualified to step in.
Yeah, I'm nobody who thinks that you should go to school and get a degree to become a journalist. I didn't do that, so I joined Liz here in saying that I have a useless film and video degree. So I wanted to just make something that I was able to do into a regular career because I was amassing a following, and it seemed like the best way to fall back and maybe find some way to live a stable life. And so the kinds of advice that I usually give to people who want to get involved in this kind of work, as difficult and arduous as it may be right now, is to say that you should pick that one thing that really animates you. I mean, if it is covering what's going on with Julian Assange, you could do that, but there's also whatever's happening in your community. There's all kinds of stories happening around you on any given day. And I think if WikiLeaks does anything to inspire you, it's the inspiration to keep digging deeper and trying to find more and to challenge what is around you and look for more answers to the way the world works. And, you know, people know me for my coverage of the Chelsea Manning case, but I doggedly reported that and stayed on that, and I've continued to follow that as especially as, you know, she was dragged back to jail in this past year with the grand jury subpoena. And I continued doing that as Julian Assange's case picked up in April after he was expelled from the embassy. And so that remained my sole focus. So you can cover all kinds of different stories, but what I'm saying is, if you really want to do this successfully, what you should probably do is become known as a person who is a go-to source for one particular thing. For the rest of my life, whether Chelsea likes it or not, I'm the Chelsea Manning journalist. And that's sort of the way that you work your way into being essential.
I'll weigh in on this a little bit. I share the same perspectives that Liz and Kevin share, but I actually have a little bit of a different story. I have a degree in English, but I went back to get my master's in journalism, and I would advise everybody not to do that. In all seriousness, I would encourage you not to do that. You will be indoctrinated. You will be, absolutely. What I find fascinating too is, so I'll backtrack a little bit. It was a very difficult process as far as working on a final project to kind of put something into the academic record that really highlighted the necessity of having independent journalism, there's just a fundamental clash in ideology there. Independent journalism on a university level among academics is viewed upon as advocacy journalism. And you will be indoctrinated, and they do teach you, at least at a state university, that these mainstream outlets are the way to go. And essentially, there is no discussion whatsoever about changing media models or anything like that, or changing media landscape, if you will. So yeah, I would encourage people actually not to do that. And there's other things that you can, study, but don't do that. And also too, as similar to what was said earlier, you don't even really, need an education to do this. If you have ideas and things that you are passionate about and that you're willing to put effort into, you can do it. And I share the same thoughts, Liz. I definitely would like to see Misty make videos or make her own blog, because her account is awesome and has some really insightful ideas. And yeah, great question though, Steve.
That was for you. That was my birthday present to you, T. It's Taylor's birthday, by the way.
Well, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
No, I did the approach to journalism all backwards, I guess. I don't know. I went to Purdue University for a year. I didn't have any plans outside of a basic BA degree or whatever, and went and traveled for about 10 years, started writing, wrote an article that got me fired from The Nation and subsequently blacklisted, and it just have kind of existed on the periphery ever since. But I like it over here because there's room to maneuver and swear and occasionally smoke. So, it's better here, I believe. Let's talk a little bit about the face of journalism going forward, especially now that hacktivists, leaktivists, and public disclosure outlets are considered to be under the umbrella of terror groups, and the ways that we as journalists, content creators, can protect each other and support each other and continue to get out good work. And Ray, if you want to kick this off, that would be cool.
Sure. Well, I think we need to be bold. We also need to be understanding. People do have to make a living. If you're independently wealthy, that's great, because then you can be inspired and you'd follow your target or your issue. And that's where call comes. You're called to do this and you have the ability to do it. Not everybody has independent means, so it's really good advice not to go to journalism school. So how do you start? How do you get? You start writing. You start by doing. In the Army, they always said, we learn by doing. Okay, now one has to go in with one's eyes open and realize that there is what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. Now, most people know, at least most people in our circles know, that military-industrial complex is pretty much what runs the media, what runs the established media. So it's a congressional complex as well, and it was back when Ike decided to make that final address, and his brother said, you ought to say military-industrial congressional complex, and Ike said, nah, that's a little too much. I'm going to get in trouble for enough here. Okay, so what I use now is not the MIC, military-industrial complex, but the Mickey Mat, okay? Now, if you have a pencil, you might want to write this down. The military-industrial congressional intelligence media academe think tank complex, Mickey Mat. What is a media? Because media is what enables the whole thing to work. And the way that happens, of course, is that the mega corporations that control the media and who, not incidentally, profiteer on war build machines for war, selling machines for war, They control everything. So people have to go into this with their eyes open and say, now, am I going to get onto the New York Times or the Washington Post or any reputable newspaper right away? No, not right away. You have to sort of build up your credentials and build up your following. Kevin's example is terrific. I think I first met Kevin at Fort Meade when he was covering the then Bradley Manning trial. And I have great respect for him. And this is possible for lots of people who have the brains and the, what's the word? The
moxie.
Moxie. Yeah, you gotta, and you can't always be worried about a career or anything like that. I remember contributing to some of Kevin's first works with some money, actually. Not that I have a lot of money, but when he goes on assignment, he needs somebody to support him. So all I'm saying here is that it's not so bleak. The fifth estate exists. They're not going to be able to eliminate the fifth estate. They'll try, and they are trying, okay? But it's so new, and that's why Julian is such a threat, because they can't control it completely. And so my advice to young people who aspire to do real journalism, independent journalism, non-fettered journalism, and maybe not make so much money, is to do it. Try it. See if it works. And if you have to do it part-time, well, that's okay at first. Last I'll say is that I became a journalist at the Central Intelligence Agency. I did a sort of a daily publication for the president, actually directly for Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, whose coterie I briefed every morning down where they lived or where they worked. Now, becoming a journalist in that way gives you kind of a feel for, you got to do it today, or the Washington Times or the Washington Post or the New York Times will mess it up tomorrow, and that will inform people's opinion on this. So that's the other thing that I suffer from, this immediacy syndrome, where if I see something, even if it's 10 o'clock at night, I try to persuade Joe Laurie of Consortium News, look, can you stay up till midnight? Because I really like to get this on the record so people have it to read before they read the New York Times or the Washington Post. Now, that doesn't often work so well, but at least there is a horizon of attention that you have to sort of make sure you realize, because after they've read the New York Times, they're going to see your title and say, oh, I already read that. That happened in the intelligence community as well. So that's my particular focus. I like to do it like right away. And I think that could be inculcated in people. Kevin does that. Other people do that. And it's possible to do. It might not be as finished or as eloquent as you want to make it, but you're doing a job to inform people, not to impress people. That's the last part of my message.
Nobody be shy. This is not a shy program. You got something to say, like jump right in. And say, I appreciate the level of professionalism and respect we're all showing each other, but it's Sunday. We're like at the barbecue after church now, so we can just be ourselves and jump in whenever. This is cabin style now. Nobody speak at once.
Well. Yes,
Kevin,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Liz, because you haven't spoke at all.
Well, I was going to add to what Ray was just saying and say that for me, I'm kind of the opposite, actually. I like doing like long form articles that are more historical and not as much about the breaking news of the day. And I find that I like to do that because then when people are then later, maybe years later, looking up a particular issue, then that article might come up and help inform them about this theme or this topic. I'm actually I would say for my own journalism, I'm pretty not the best at the breaking news of the day type stuff, but I really do like those 2,000 word articles, like comparing Pinochet and his attempted extradition with Assange's extradition, those types of, that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago that those types of events were actually happening, but they're still relevant now, and bringing up that history is really fun for me. So I think what I would take away from that is that there are so many different types of journalism, even within the really genuine independent stuff. You can have all these different talents versus, maybe your drawbacks or the things that you're not as good at. And so finding those things that really not just speak to you, but that you really excel at is another important part of trying to become an independent journalist.
So I'm struck by one thing that Ray had to say, which was that, you know, all of us have to make our living. We have to find some way in order to, if you're going to make journalism a thing that you do on a regular basis, then you're going to start to think, how might I be able to bring in some money so that I can do this more often? Because otherwise, if you're working a job, let's say, as one of these essential workers right now that are out on the front lines and at tremendous risk, if that's where you would find yourself, I don't see how you would really have the energy to do the sort of journalism that we're talking about here. I don't think anybody would expect you to find the mental space to do that on a daily basis. So you might have to write for outlets. You might have to align yourselves with organizations that have their own flaws, that aren't perfect, that have written or given platforms to people who we would disagree with. You may have to do what I guess in the business we would say sell out, although there are many different shades and degrees to selling out. But I suppose as long as you continue to maintain your own integrity and you continue to remember what's important to you and what got you into the business, it's okay to cut a paycheck from these places to some degree, but you should never forget why you took a job and why you decided to do journalism, which is to say that one way that we are misinformed in the US and one reason why there is this issue where we've been able to see Julian Assange be utterly demonized, where Wikileaks is basically deemed this anti-secrecy organization, as they like to call it, where it's treated as this kind of hostile, well, if you use Mike Pompeo's term, it's a hostile intelligence agency, a non-state hostile intelligence agency. And one reason they've been able to succeed in that is because, you know, there are ways in which our government get us to think about certain organizations and how they have biases or how they don't have biases. Of course, we are led to believe that the New York Times and the Washington Post are balanced and objective media institutions, while on the other hand, it's increasingly acceptable to see Fox News as the right-wing media organization. That took some activism over time. You know, now the Trump supporters see CNN as the liberal media bastion that's out to topple Donald Trump. So it's increasingly acceptable to see. We see MSNBC as this liberal organization. It's really a media arm of the Democratic National Committee when you get right down to it. So I'm sort of working out how we start to think of different organizations having biases, and different smaller internet organizations that have people who fund them. Those color our understanding of those media organizations. And then you get to state media. There are several different ways that you might be able to be employed for state-funded media. I have friends that work for Russian-funded media outlets. And, you know, I don't think we should be so quick to marginalize people who work for Russian state-funded media or even Chinese-funded state media and suggest that they are just working against our own interests because they happen to receive a paycheck from governments that our U.S. government see as enemies of the United States. It isn't that black and white. And most of these people who I know who work for these projects have editorial independence that they would not have if they worked at CNN or the New York Times, or maybe even at The Nation magazine. And so I think it's fairly complex. And that's one reason why it's been difficult to mobilize people to support Julian Assange, because they feel like when he took his show for Russia Today to interview different people, that he was somehow doing something as like an asset for the Russian government. And that it wasn't just him taking a job to do a show that was maybe to him, a once in a lifetime opportunity to do a kind of program where you could interview people and be on air and talk to world leaders and have conversations that we should have with people who are influential. And I think that happens to a lot of people. And when you look at what is off limits and not covered, what's third rail in our establishment news press, it's quite easy to see that the jobs that are available for journalists shrink dramatically if you actually care about what matters in the world. If you care about these issues that we are talking about today on World Press Freedom Day, then your options for where to go find work become extraordinarily limited. And if you're not able to mobilize people to support you, and you don't have a page, say maybe through one of the platforms like Patreon, or some people are using something called Substack now to get people to donate to them, then you can't do what you're doing on a regular basis. So I think it's important to, I talk this out, and I believe it connects back to Julian Assange, because everyone just assumes that he could do all of this and maintain this kind of perspective that we expect all journalists to have in the United States. But once the United States government made him an enemy of the US government, he had to shift the way that he acted on a daily basis. And that meant maybe interacting with countries that the US doesn't like, and interacting with those world leaders, because he had to protect himself from losing any freedom that he had.
That is a fantastic point. And the U.S. military is always telling us how the United States must maintain its superiority in terms of asymmetrical warfare. And I think the only way to combat that is fluid asymmetrical journalism. And the concept of scientific journalism, the concept that no amount of force can solve a math problem, is something that we need to, hammer home as often as possible. If you watched the show before, I never miss an opportunity to kick around Mike Pompeo. So I want to read his statement on World Press Freedom Day. It says, "We commend the efforts of journalists working in repressive environments to support the free flow of accurate information. We call for the release of all journalists imprisoned for their reporting." That is Mike Pompeo saying that. So I feel like we have an opportunity here to kind of, sandbag his social media with pictures of Julian Assange and Julian Assange quotes today. And I would like to extend that call to the people who are listening right now. And
that will actually, I was going to say, that'll be our first call to action for this week that we put out on Tuesday, is thanking Mike Pompeo for agreeing that Julian Assange should be freed. But I do want to ask.
Said that. That
What?
takes such guts. For him to do that is just so, I don't know. I see it as a slap in the face, to be honest, considering what he said about a media entity, WikiLeaks. And for him to put out that tweet is just so ridiculous. I'm really shocked that he actually even said anything about this day.
That's some brass ones, ain't it?
They operate in a parallel environment, okay? Now, Mike Pompeo graduated first in his class from the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, which says to me in bas relief, you can get all A's and flunk life, okay? The guy is, why would he brag about lying, cheating, and doing all these other things? I mean, it just, how does he look to the rest of the world? He's our foreign minister, right? He's our Secretary of State. So anything we can do to deflate Pompeo, and I could just hear the air coming out of him if we put a pin in his stomach. We ought to do it, and people don't realize, and I've heard this is maybe just a rumor, that the reason he had to leave the army was because he couldn't run a mile in less than 15 minutes. So, there you go. That's a rumor, but, the guy never saw combat.
There was a journalist in Italy, actually, that walked up to Mike Pompeo on stage relatively recently handed him a bag of dog food and said, "Eat this 3 times a day. It'll help you become at least as loyal as a dog." And then she was promptly escorted off of the stage. So anything we can do to add on to that, I think, is a wonderful idea right now.
Amen.
So, Kevin, could you talk a little bit about your work with the Chelsea Manning leaks?
Yeah, so I mean, in the Chelsea Manning leaks are also the Julian Assange documents for which he's being prosecuted. So that's the overlap. And I think one thing that we can bring into this discussion that hasn't been spoken about yet, and maybe is stunning to people who have been following, is this grand jury that was impaneled back in late 2010, early 2011, which was set up to basically destroy a media organization. And it's one way that I have carefully talked about the President Obama's administration and then Donald Trump's administration is to point out that even if President Obama did not make the ultimate choice, and I guess we're really talking about the Justice Department here, even though the Justice Department under Obama didn't make the decision to proceed with the prosecution of Julian Assange, you still had this grand jury and they never shut it down. It was never closed up. It continued to be impaneled and as far as we know, existed in some form right up until and laid dormant for Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was well, I think he's actually really a joke, but Donald Trump made him serious by appointing him the Attorney General, and then you had to take him seriously. I'm not sure that anybody in the Senate really took Jeff Sessions and the things he had to say seriously until he was given a position of power in the Justice Department to run it, and he brought his zealous dislike of leaks to that position. I mean, he spoke about, he was one of the few senators before he was Attorney General who wanted to have something like an Official Secrets Act passed in the United States. And he would talk about this. I think he even backed some kind of legislation that I believe Joe Lieberman was a co-sponsor or was in favor of. And so he was there in the Justice Department before he left and became a hero of the hashtag resistance army and everything. And he was responsible for the initiation, as I understand it, of going after Julian Assange, of crossing that line that the Obama administration went up to and didn't cross. And this grand jury, I've compared it to, in my work, the writings I've done, I've compared this grand jury to the grand jury that existed during the Pentagon Papers. It was in Massachusetts. It was investigating people who were, and including targeting journalists that were passing around the Pentagon Papers, was, I think, even activists were potentially in the crosshairs during that time. So Chelsea Manning's leaks, the fact that we have all of this material, as we've said over and over again. We know so much. We know so many aspects of how the war machine functions. We know so much about how our corps of diplomats function around the world. One example that we haven't put forward yet was that I like to reference is we know all of this information about drones right now that we didn't know before WikiLeaks. And of course, a lot of proliferation happened after those WikiLeaks disclosures. But our first glimpse at this whole thing of having a kill list and playing judge, jury, and executioner really came with this cable that was disclosed that involved John Brennan, where he was telling Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen that if you we were going to launch cruise missile attacks and we would fight Al Qaeda in Yemen, and if you could just say that those are your bombs and not ours, we would really appreciate it. So to tell the world that it was in fact Yemen who was fighting the people who were suspected Al Qaeda militants, and then the U.S. could pretend like it had nothing to do with any of that violence or warfare that was going on. And that was a huge revelation because it showed the way in which the U.S. was transforming the world into a battlefield even further in the post 9/11 era, and revealed something that they were trying to keep hidden. And yeah, I think everything that Chelsea Manning has gone through so far. This whole thing of hauling her before the grand jury was clearly an attempt to put her in a position where she turned against Julian Assange. And I think we have to give her all the credit in the world for resisting and standing up to the US government and not allowing herself to break. She didn't have to do it. I wouldn't have thought less of her, especially with what she's gone through, if she had given some kind of very, very basic answers to the government because she was forced into that position. And this is a transgender woman who went through multiple procedures and was receiving therapy and treatment before, and had that totally disrupted and upended by being brought back to jail. And had she been going through mental hardship and duress, I mean, she had already been in solitary confinement and abused in military, in a military prison, and when she was in military detention. Had she broken and decided to say something, I wouldn't have thought any less of her, but she stood strong and firm. And I could see myself, as I was at the 1 week hearing, how monumental it was that they were not able to break Chelsea Manning, because what they wanted was to be able to use her words against Julian Assange, and they still don't. They still have her narrative to contend with. The fact that Chelsea Manning put forward in a courtroom back in February, I was there to hear it back in February of 2013 before the trial kicked off, and she pled guilty to some offenses. They have this official narrative, and it undermines everything about this conspiracy theory that the U.S. Justice Department has concocted about Julian Assange. That is absolutely not true. Everything that they say about Julian Assange in the indictment rests upon a conspiracy theory that they can't prove because it doesn't match what Chelsea Manning said to a military court. And so I think she deserves all the credit in the world for standing up for Julian Assange. And even if that was not her intention, that's the effect.
And I would like to break in to thank you for being her publicist and for making it possible for us to know all this stuff that's going on. It's really, Kevin, it was really an amazing performance on your part. And as I see the challenge is to get my highly educated friends to read your stuff, to know what kind of a heroine she really is. I'd like to, may I add another thought about young people who might be looking at this and aspire to become journalists? I was not a young people. I was already maybe 60. When I was working for a church, it happened to be a very progressive church. I was teaching and running a school called the Servant Leadership School in inner city Washington. And I was spending my evenings writing op-eds before the war in Iraq. And I had people in San Francisco, the San Francisco Examiner at the time. There was some other less than mainstream media people who would take my stuff. Finally, the pastor who ran all this stuff said, look, Ray, when are you writing this stuff? And I said, oh, my God, he's going to think that I'm doing this on his time. I said, well, at night. He said, well, I think you should be doing this full time. I said, well, yeah, but I need the salary you're giving me to be the director of this school. He said, that's all right. We'll do that. We'll do that. You do this full time. And he arranged the money, and it wasn't a lot. But he did the funding. So what I'm saying is that another outlet or another access point could be a progressive church. And I'll just end with what he told me. I said, if you're going to pay me the same salary and I can do this full time, that would be great. I can go make speeches and I can do interviews. But what's in it for your church? And he said, well, we're going to insist that you say the Ecumenical Church of the Savior in your byline. I said, I'd be proud to do that, but what's in it for the church? He said, look, he says, two things. And I remember this to this day. Two things. Number one, you're doing what church should be doing. Church should be looking for the truth, okay? You're doing it, okay? And number two, when they come for you, Ray, I want it to be so that they'll have to come for all of us. Now, that's the kind of church that exists in certain places. You have to seek it out. And if you're a faith person, or if you adhere to the ideals of that particular church or worshiping community, they will support you if they have the same incentive to spread some truth around. So that's what I'm working for still now. And that was 15, 16 years ago. It's called Tell the Word. And I still put it in my byline as a commitment. And they're still paying me a modest sum to do this. It's a very modest sum, but it makes the difference between my early retirement benefit and what I also need to live. So there are all kinds of ways to skin this cat, if you will. And you have to be a little imaginative, a little inventive. I wasn't either. It just sort of fell in my lap by a very progressive pastor who said, look, you're doing what a church should be doing, and we're going to support you, even if it means that when they come for you, they'll have to come for the rest of us. I was blessed by that, and I jumped at the chance.
This is making me realize that I need to get you onto my show with the Reverend Annie Chambers out of Baltimore. I don't know if you've met her, familiar with her, but she runs the People's Power Assembly. Her big brother was Malcolm X's lieutenant for a number of years. She's a very prolific activist in that region, and was part of the group that came down with us when we went to demonstrate in front of the prison that was holding Chelsea Manning and Jeremy Hammond at the time during the first week of Julian's extradition hearing. An incredible woman. I'm gonna have her on my show next week on Mother's Day. That's gonna be great. I don't want to take away from this too much by talking my own show. So moving forward, I have no idea how much time anyone has. So if we want to kind of like take a lap around the panel here and just give what would pass for closing thoughts, and then piggyback off each other if it goes that way, that would be terrific. I do want to thank everyone for taking the time to be with us today. I feel like World Press Freedom Day is something that we need to really highlight in an era of just all-encompassing surveillance and self-censorship in both mainstream and independent media, and we've got to try to be as fearless as Julian Assange has been these last 12-15 years.
Yeah, I will go ahead and start. It's great to be back here again with you guys. I want to thank our guests again, Ray, Kevin, and Liz and Cynthia for coming on. Today is a really important day. And what I found really interesting was that today's World Press Freedom Day for 2020, they have themes, I guess, every year. And this year's theme was about journalists who are at risk and journalists being fearless in their reporting. And there was also a sub-theme, which was specifically about independent journalism. If you look at the website, it is there, which I thought was super interesting that those were the themes. But anyways, I just want to thank everybody again for coming on. And also, too, I know that this was discussed on Thursday's vigil, but we're in a really, really unfortunate position right now. Not that we didn't already know that our intelligence agencies were politicized and very corrupt. We're continuing to see that, and there doesn't seem to be enough pushback against that. And that really does kind of go hand in hand with the topics that we tend to cover on these vigils. So I just wanted to say, with this latest release of the report that's related to the Stone case, I just wanted to say that that was really ridiculous that Politico, I believe, was trying to claim that those communications were like a bombshell. And it's really unfortunate that the intelligence agencies and journalists are using another journalist, Julian Assange, to continue with a fake Russian conspiracy that they interfered in our election. I just wanted to make that note. And again, this is about World Press Freedom Day. So again, thanks everybody. I think that's the third time I said that. But it was great to be back and to take the time to talk about these issues and to highlight Julian's case, Chelsea's case, and others. And also Ola Bini as well. I saw that, of course, he was a year ago, he spent his birthday in prison. Today is his birthday as well. He just tweeted about it. So always remembering people who have may have fallen under the radar a little bit, highlighting their situations is always super important too. And the various whistleblowers and journalists who put their lives at risk for the truth.
Well, maybe I'll jump in here.
You go ahead, Ray. Go ahead.
I just want to say thanks for having me on, giving me a chance to say some things. I guess the most important thing for me over the last month or so has been the appearance of Gabriel, Max, and Stella Morris. Now I know what makes Julian even stronger in his determination to live through this. And I think it should make us stronger too. Not only stronger, but maybe more clever. I mean, this is real human interest story, for God's sake. And Stella has, as you know, written letters and come out. It's really good that she did that, I think, even though it was provoked by that judge. So what I would suggest is that, let's think about intelligent ways to emphasize the human aspect of what's going on. These little kids have their dad in danger of being infected, in danger of being killed, okay? And that should mean something if, indeed, as I still believe, there are enough people in the world that are still human and still care about what happens to somebody else. I'll say goodbye now.
I guess I'll jump in then. I completely agree with everything everyone has said, and I just wanted to add, because we were talking about, people, we were kind of speaking to people who might want to become journalists, and I would say, especially with everything that Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning as well have gone through, because of their heroic efforts to share the truth with the public, I think it should really be emphasized as well that it's not simply a challenge to be paid and make a living. It's also a fact that the more truthful, the more on target your journalism is, the more pushback you're going to get. And so we have Julian Assange facing the ultimate censorship now and has been for years. So that is a reality that you have to kind of have your eyes open to as you go into it, as well as everything else. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just know that the pushback is going to happen. Maybe you'll get smeared personally, whatever, it's going to be there. And to know that, if you can be brave like Assange has been and keep going anyway, then that's a real calling and a vocation, not simply a job to earn money and pay for your rent. So,
amen.
Thank you.
Well, the thing that I'll end with and say is something that I'm a little disappointed I didn't raise earlier, because it is probably one of the more pressing aspects of this case. And it is the fact that there was a security company in Spain called Undercover Global that was, in fact, enlisted, as we understand, by U.S. intelligence. It's believed that they were working on behalf of the CIA, but if not the CIA, they were working for other parts of our intelligence industrial complex, so to speak, and they were targeting everyone that went in and out of the Ecuador embassy as they were visiting Julian Assange. This included his attorneys, this included journalists, and this included people who were visiting him, especially Americans and or Russians. This was reported extensively and has been covered very well by El País in Spain, which is a Spanish newspaper. Of course, when CNN had a chance to look at the documents, all the documentation that came related to the Spanish security company, which its owner, David Morales, is now facing a lawsuit in Spain for violating the privacy rights of Julian Assange and engaging in other offenses. But when it came time for the CNN to get a crack at this, rather than highlight the risks posed to people's freedoms, they decided to further fuel our hysteria around Russia, and they completely blew it in their coverage. And so, the thing that should be focused on here is that we've seen this before. We've seen journalists targeted by the CIA. The thing that John Kiriakou, who is a CIA whistleblower, told me when I talked to him about this is he said, "I remember how this was supposed to be a no-go back after the 1970s, after we had these committees in Congress that were set up, and it was thought that this was off limits, that you wouldn't." But he says John felt like maybe that's falling away, maybe it's come back, or maybe it's because Julian Assange isn't considered a journalist by the CIA that it would be okay to target him. But then that doesn't really excuse targeting journalists that are going to go interview Julian Assange. So how do you explain people from around the world who are journalists going in there and being targeted? And one of the things that's most vivid to me was the fact that you had people visiting like Stefania Marizzi, who's a very good Italian journalist on this case, who was targeted. And she described to me in an interview going to the embassy back in December 2017. And she went there in March 2018 as well to visit. This was, of course, as the surveillance was escalating against the embassy, it was happening at the same time that Lenin Moreno came into power. So you had a changing of the political ideology, the political bent of the government. So that impacted. But, you have guards that were collecting data, forcing people to hand over their phones. One thing I'll never forget in one of the El País reports is that Ella Nakashima from the Washington Post went to the embassy and was doing some reporting. And one of the guards there took her phone battery out of the phone and, in fact, tried to keep the battery, but memorialized, and I still to this day cannot believe that this was written down in a document for us to see later, put down that he would have kept the battery except the woman came back and asked for the phone battery to be handed back to her. So she said, "Oh, I guess I wasn't going to be able to get away with it." So she was able to leave with her phone battery. So you have all kinds of actions like this going on at the embassy while Julian was there. And, the one thing that I've also come away with, and I think this is in all fairness to Julian Assange on World Press Freedom Day, because the press has relentlessly attacked him and demonized him. And there were a lot of jokes about, remember the story that was run early days of after Cablegate and going at Julian and making fun of him because he used to go around disguised as a woman because he thought that the CIA might be following him. And when you see what happened with the Spanish security company and you think about the lengths to which they went to target him, it doesn't seem that comical or insane anymore to want to disguise yourself as a woman so that people from the U.S. government can't follow you. I mean, I think it's the U.S. press that collectively owes Julian Assange an apology.
And to piggyback on that,
you were right about that. Go ahead, Andrew. I've talked a lot today.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say to piggyback and close out on that point with the UC Global case. We talked to Cassandra Fairbanks the week that we were in D.C. during Julian's first round of extradition hearings. And she told us the story about how she had found out that it was the Chelsea Manning leaks that they were going to go after Julian for. So she goes to the embassy to tell him. They lock her in a room for hours, basically like a utility closet was the way that she described it. And that's more or less when everything to me seems like it would be solidified, like, yes, this is 100% under observation. She even goes as far as to talk about how one of the people that she had been in contact with in the Trump administration contacted her in regards to it and basically said, like, you're nuts, more or less. But also trying to take Julian Assange's children's diapers out of the garbage to run DNA tests on them is another one of the horrendous things that they've done, UC Global. So I would like to thank everybody for hopping in here with us, and Cynthia McKinney, who's no longer in the stream with us right now. But also a big shout out to RSFO for helping out behind the scenes. And then also Alex Hill with Candles for Assange, because she's done an amazing job putting this all together. She's still going. She's over on Unity for Jay and the Mexico City stream right now. So a big thank you to her. And yeah, you can find us on action_4 Assange on Twitter or actionforassange.com.
So, happy World Press Freedom Day to everyone. I really thank you guys so much for being a part of this. To the people who are watching right now, we love you guys. Thank you for taking part in this with us. We're hoping that all of these efforts will build kind of just a solid wall of journalists, of truth tellers, of people who are unafraid because of the collective support that exists to take another step in getting out accurate information. And just to kind of close out, it is insane to me that the reason that Julian Assange is still in Belmarsh prison right now is because he hasn't been convicted of anything. He is being held on remand as a political prisoner, the most important political prisoner of our time, ahead of the world's biggest press freedom case in I don't know how many years. So share this information, help get it out there. Don't be afraid to talk about it. There are people who will look at you skeptically, or like you may have tinfoil on your head. If you're like, look, there's a outlet called Wikileaks that shows you primary source material, and then you get to make up your mind about it. People are so used to being spoon-fed what their opinion needs to be that I think that oftentimes they forget that they're allowed to formulate an opinion just based on primary source material. So in an effort to emulate the fearlessness of an outlet like WikiLeaks and a human being like Julian Assange, please know that you are not alone as a supporter of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, or Chelsea Manning. And congratulations to Chelsea on her 51st day of freedom. She spent 77% of her adult life incarcerated, a quarter of that in solitary confinement, and the strength and courage that she has shown is got to be a massive inspiration to everyone familiar with the case. Until next time, this has been the Free Assange Vigil on our special World Press Freedom Day event. My name is Steve Boykinen. Good luck to us all.